They were in Iraq and Iran, and when the Islamic folks took over Iran and they had a war, part of that was that the Iranians said, we don't want these folks that aren't Islamic here. And so they basically told all 70,000 they had to get out of the country like now, and they left. And today they live in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. And these Gnostic folks didn't arise out of Christian times, and they were there before Jesus was even born. They were in the eastern of Israel, and the Eastern religions that came into the Roman Empire were what's called mystical. That means they had a lot of ideas. I think pretty much they made up themselves. But anyway, this was this group that's still around today, all the way through 2,000 years, that are still what's called Gnostics. Okay, anyway, I mentioned also how last week about the triumph. Can somebody tell me in one word what the triumph was? A victory, parade, celebration. Okay, that's 3 words. I was looking for parade. And what I forgot to tell you when I mentioned the Arch of Titus last week was that part of the parade was everybody walking under the arch. That is, like I told you about 3 days of the triumph. The first day would be the loot. The second day would be the army coming through. And the third day would be the slaves. And they would all walk under that arch. It was a way of saying, here's the people that won the victory for us. And the arch was to commemorate the victory. And it's called the Arch of Titus because Titus was who? He became an emperor, but as far as the war with the Jews, he was the general in charge of the Roman armies that finished the war. And the war went on for 7 years. Vespasian, his father, started out as general of that army, and then he came back to Rome and became emperor, and Titus finished up the war, and they named the Arch of Titus. And I realized that I hadn't told you everything I wanted to say because I got distracted, which I tend to do. And so instead of talking to you, I'm going to show you some pictures. Everybody likes pictures, okay? So, Aaron, are we ready? We're going to go to number 1. Last week, Ted July mentioned that part of the loot that they brought back, which was huge amount of gold and all kinds of things, was used to build that building, which is the Colosseum, and that's how it looks today. But to give you just a little bit of understanding about it, you see the floor is just all open there. There's a walkway across it, okay? That floor was originally wood, and it was watertight. So sometime, and they would cover it with sand, cover the wood with sand, and that's where the gladiators would fight. That's where, in later years, Christians were put out in the Colosseum to fight lions, and of course that meant they always lost, which was a way of killing Christians, and so forth. Well, the wood floor rotted away a long time ago, but what was under the wood floor? It was all of those hallways and rooms, and that's where they kept the animals that were going to be used in the spectacle at the Colosseum that day, and also the gladiators and the prisoners, like Christians. Christians would be in some of those rooms waiting to come out to basically die, okay? Now you see on the far side where the white is? Want to know what the white is? I'm going to tell you. The white is marble, and the seats at that spot were for the wealthy, the rich, and especially the emperor. That's where the emperor sat when he came in to see at the Colosseum. And by the way, did they have the activities at the Colosseum once a week, once a year? Every day for centuries. And it was free. Wonderful entertainment of people killing people, that the Romans would come and cheer for the people they liked and boo the people they didn't. And if you watched any movies, you know they would do this, which meant the guy doesn't die, and they do this, which meant kill the guy, that kind of thing. Okay, I also forgot to tell you something else about the triumph, because I talked about a triumph that went on for 3 days. Sometimes the triumphs would go on for a week or 2. And what I forgot to tell you then was, in addition to all of the parades and this, that, and the other, Rome fed the entire city morning, noon, and night for as long as the triumph went on. This was a banquet for the entire city. When Rome did something, they had the ability, they had the money, they had the power, and they did it. These triumphs were not little things. These were big things. And they used the money to build the Colosseum from the war against the Jews. They also used it to build another building. Next slide. This was called the Temple of Peace. They called it the Temple of Peace because after they killed almost all the Jews, they had peace. And into the Temple of Peace is where the menorah went. Someone tell me what the menorah was? It's the 7-tiered candlestick that was taken out of the temple in Jerusalem. It was basically solid gold. And the table of shewbread was also put in the temple. And there were other things that were put in the temple from the war between the Romans and the Jews. And this is the ruins today in the Roman center of Rome in the Forum of the temple. Let's go on to the next one. Now this is the Arch of Titus. This is the arch under which all of the people involved in the triumph would walk. And it looks kind of small there, but if you look down at the bottom, you'll see people standing there. I took this picture. Some of these pictures you guys have seen before, because when we were studying the book of Acts, in Acts 28, where Paul goes to Rome, I brought and showed pictures of these. I've shown you this picture before. But if you see the people there, you can see how tall the arch is. And it was 50 feet or so tall. And it was wide. It's wide enough at the bottom that you could have a chariot, you could have people in quantity walking underneath. And this was on what they call the Via Roma, which was the main road going north and south in and out of Rome. And the armies came in from the south, and they all walked under that arch for the triumph. Okay, next one. Now this is the one. I have a hard time talking about this one. You guys know I can get emotional. Why? Because you see the 7 candlestick? That's the menorah. This is a symbol that Jews use to this day for their faith. You can't see it real good, but on the right, you'll see a couple of guys with things sticking up like that. You can't see it real good, but on the right was the table of showbread. The table of showbread was not a small, light thing. It was rather heavy, and it was also pure gold. I mean, this was massive amount of gold right here that was referenced in this. Now, the day that Titus and the people and the slaves and the Roman army came through, this and one I'm going to show you next wasn't there. They put a space for it here, but they didn't have it there because they made this and attached it to the inside of the Arch of Titus after the parade and everything was over, which means that the person who carved this was looking at the menorah when he carved it. Yeah. I stood there for about half an hour looking at that from the temple. Okay, enough of that. Next one. Now this is a replica of what's on the other side of the arch. And that's Titus with his chariot with people cheering off on the side and the Roman army coming in with him. So one side of the arch is Titus the champion. The other side is the loot that they brought back from Jerusalem under the arch. Okay? Let's go to the next one. This is the ceiling of the arch. If you look to the right, you can see the menorah over there. This ceiling, you're going to see again in a few minutes. This ceiling design, squares, and in the middle of each square is a flower, is found in literally hundreds of buildings all over the world. This arch has been around for 2,000 years, and people have copied this architecture to build buildings everywhere. I saw this design and ceiling numerous places when I traveled around Europe. I was in Europe in 1973, and I went to the Roman Forum, and I'm going to show you a good example of this in a minute. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Does that building mean anything to you? What's that called? I can't speak French. Arc de Triomphe, yeah, but that's terrible French, okay? In English, it's the Arch of Triumph. The same word that was used in Rome for the celebration of a victory. Now, who had this building built? Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon thought, and was a pretty great general, he won an immense number of battles, and he wanted something that would last in his mind forever, to be a praise of him and his battles. But I want you to notice something. Look at the arch above it. How is that arch built above it? On the underside of the arch. That's a copy of the Arch of Titus in Rome. This is in Paris, by the way, okay? Now, I didn't get that. I got that picture off the internet. Go to the next one. I took this picture. It shows you can see this arch. You can see the squares with the flowers in the middle. But he had side arches also built in that big building, and it has the same kind of ceiling. Now, there's words going up that pillar. On the left, you see those words? Those are the names of the cities, the places where Napoleon or some other great French general won a war. And each of the walls of the main arch have those names up and down. Napoleon was not a peaceful guy. He thought war was a great and wonderful thing. And he was real proud of all the battles that he was in and fought. Okay. Any comments on any of this so far?
It's interesting that the Tour de France 21-day moving bicycle race ends underneath that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm glad you said that. When World War II ended, he made a comment, and he said that, the Tour de France, the bicycle race, they ended at the arch. Okay? I'm glad you said that because I'd already forgotten something else I was going to say. When World War II was going along, Europe was invaded by Americans and British and the Free French, right? And then they came and took Paris. And then they had a parade. And guess what they did? They all walked under that arch. Because that's what you do with Arch of Triumph. Because they had beat the Germans. However, there was another army walked under that arch. Because when Hitler took France, he had all of his German troops walk under the arch. Back in 1940 or so. Oh yeah. French people weren't cheering that day. They all pretty much stayed home. Okay, anyway, let's go on to the next one. I took this picture in 1973 when I was there. You can see the ugly French cars that they have there. I took this picture partly because when Napoleon had this thing built, he didn't just want it to be there huge. He wanted to be the center of kind of life, at least in that part of Paris. There are 12 streets that come together right there at the arch. And you can see this street all by itself is, 5 lanes or something like that. It's a big street. There are 12 that come into the arch here at this spot. It became what would you call it? The center of all that area of Paris. They redid the streets to make it work that way. And the last one, go to the next one. I took this picture to show how you've got the traffic, you've got the shops, and you've got the arch that's lit at night. It is really a major attraction in Paris. But it was the arch. It is the Arch of Triumph, just like the smaller one in Rome is at the conclusion of the Jewish War. Any other comments about this kind of stuff? Okay, we are going to get to 1 John. I'm hoping we might actually start reading it today, but I'm not going to guarantee that because we got a few more things we need to talk about before then. I ask you to turn to Colossians. When we were talking about Philemon, we talked about Colossae, the Colossian letter, because the man Philemon, it would appear, lived in Colossae. But when Paul wrote the letter to the Colossians, it was during his second time in prison in Rome, and this is the one that he didn't get released. This is the one where he was killed, which means that it was written in the early AD 60s. Now, Gnosticism became a much more serious problem in the church later after AD 70, AD 90, and so on, and in the second century it became a problem. But it was already a problem in the 60s in the church in Colossae, because I want to read to you a couple of verses. Now, they had another problem Remember I said that the problem was that Jewish people had brought their Jewish ideas into the church, and that's Acts chapter 15. Well, you had other people that had come more from the Eastern religions that brought their ideas into the church, their religious ideas. And Colossians was written to say to these Colossian Christians, don't follow any of this. And he's talking about some of the Jewish things that came in, as well as some of the Gnostic ideas that were influencing the Christians in Colossae back in about AD 60. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, Paul gives them a warning. Colossians 2, verse 16. Therefore, let no one act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or new moon or a Sabbath day. Now the word here that nails it down is the word Sabbath day. What religion was wanting to promote the Sabbath day? Jews, because the Sabbath day was his and always has been Saturday. And that was the day that Jews worshipped. So here was Jewish people who had become Christians trying to talk these Christians in Colossae, who were mainly all Gentiles, that they ought to be observing the Sabbath day. And of course, they weren't supposed to be observing that. Now, it also talks about food and drink. Who wanted to put rules on food and drink on Christians? The Jews again. They wanted to have the food laws out of the Old Testament. But not just Jews, it was also Gnostics also had rules about food and drink, but they were different rules than the Jews. Go down to verse 21. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. This was Jewish people and some Gnostic people that were trying to get the Jews to say, you got to follow these kinds of rules that we're teaching you. And Paul was saying, no, you don't. You're not bound by the laws on food from the Old Testament. That's what the Jews believe, but we're not. But also look at Colossians 2, verse 21. Well, 21, yeah. Okay, verse 18. Verse 18. Now, this is where Paul, to the Colossians, is talking specifically about Gnostic ideas that were being in the Colossian church around AD 60. Let no one keep defrauding you of your prize, but by delighting in self-abasement. Does somebody have a different word there? False humanity. Humility. False humility, yeah. Okay. All right. That phrase, false humility, doesn't just talk about humility. It can mean that they have a false humility, that it's actually an arrogance or a pride. But it can also talk about thinking so little of your body that you literally beat your body. And this was one thing that the Gnostics taught. I'm going to get into that today. But the Gnostics taught that the flesh was wicked, and some Gnostics said you got to beat your body to keep it under control. Physically beat your body. Have we ever heard of anybody in later Christian life that did that very thing? Come on, talk. You know. In the Catholic Church. Some of the monks would have a whip, and once a day, or whenever, they would take their clothing off and they would whip their back with the idea that whipping their back would help them avoid sin. And this didn't happen once or twice. This happened for hundreds of years. And by the way, there are other religions in the world that still do this kind of thing today. Some Hindu people in India regularly beat their body because they think it'll make them better people. Okay, anyway, he says, don't let people defraud you. That verse in verse 18, defraud, in my translation could also mean give judgment against you, means teach you wrong. He says they're false teachers when they tell you this stuff. Number one, self-abasement or false humility. The worship of angels. This is the only time this is referenced in the New Testament. But this was a Gnostic thing. They had an idea about what we call angels, but they had another word for them that I'll talk about later on. But they also believed they should worship these angelic kind of beings. And he says, no, we don't worship angels. In Christianity, who do we worship? Christ, the Father, and the Holy Spirit. We worship God, not other created beings, not other people. Okay? All right. Go on in the same verse, verse 18, the next phrase. Taking their stand on visions he has seen. Visions they have seen. Were these visions from God? No. These were visions that they had out of their own imagination. And a lot of Gnostic thinking really was dreamed up by these folks. Remember last week when I told you I read the book of the Gnostic teachings, and it was contradictory from page to page because the Gnostics didn't just have one group of beliefs. They had a whole variety of beliefs, and they had gotten them, a lot of them, just out of their own head. Till the end of the verse 18 says, inflated without cause by his fleshly mind. When it says fleshly mind, somebody have different words there? Unspiritual. Yeah, unspiritual. And that's not a bad translation there. Unspiritual minds. In other words, these are people who aren't being led by God. They're being led by their own mind to come up with their own ideas. And that's what Paul is saying to these Christians in Colossae as to what the Gnostics were all about. Go down to verse 23. Verse 23 has been a hard verse for people to understand, and it's also been translated different ways. So we're going to take a little time on the different ways that people translate verse 23. Verse 22 ends, in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men. These are matters. What these? These commandments and teachings of men. He's saying that these are all wrong. They're all just coming out of men's minds. So in verse 23, what does he say? These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom. Wisdom. We know the truth. We're going to tell you the truth, which is what the Gnostics did. But they didn't tell truth. Their truth was made up. In self-made religion, and other translations can say delight in righteousness. Somebody have other words in that second phrase, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion? I'm sorry? Will worship. What would will worship be? What does will mean there? Your own will. In other words, you're making it up yourself. You worship according to what you will. Okay? Or self-made religion is what the New American Standard says, which says you've got religion you made up yourself. It's not from God. It's from people. Self-made religion and self-abasement. What's abasement mean? Somebody have different words there? False humility. It's that same phrase. But abasement in English means punishment. And this is punishment. What? Yes. This is, again, people beating themselves. Okay? He's saying that this is what they have. Religion they've made up themselves. They beat themselves. Self-treatment. They put themselves down. But notice the last phrase. He says all of these things are of no value against fleshly indulgence. Somebody have a different set of words there?
Sensual.
I'm sorry?
Sensual indulgence.
Read the whole phrase there at the end.
They lack the value in restraining sensual.
Oh, sensual indulgence. Okay. What is Paul's conclusion about somebody beating themselves across the back or putting themselves down? He says it doesn't help you stay away from sin. You see what he's saying? That the monks through the Middle Ages that beat themselves over the back, they weren't helping themselves stay away from sin. And I would say the same thing is true for today. If you think the only way that you can stay away from sin is to hurt yourself, you're making a mistake. You know? But these verses here in Colossians, especially verse 23 and back in verse 18, was Paul talking to the Colossian Christians and saying that the Gnostic teachings that had come into the church before the destruction of Jerusalem was wrong. Okay. Any comments on any of that?
We still do that in Mexico.
What do they do? Whip themselves, really?
What they have called blood day, and now it's gotten out of hand because they put razor blades on the end of the
Ooh.
They'll stick knives through your,
Ugh. And you said it's called Blood Day?
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I do know that it's sometimes in Mexico when a person's wanting to show devotion to Christ, he'll have himself be crucified. Now, generally, they don't put nails through your feet, but generally they'll hang you up and tie you up with ropes, and you hang on a cross for a while. I mean, they take you down after a while. It's not to kill you. But that's not my idea of a good time, I'll tell you that. Okay. Well, that's what I wanted to kind of clarify from last week, and that's why we may not get into First John today, because it's already 10:30. Okay. I'd like for us to talk about the meaning of 1 John, but I said last week that what I want us to do is to see how John talks in 1 John to encourage the Christians in the right way. But remember what he's talking about. He's talking about immorality, because Gnostics were teaching you could be immoral and you were still okay. And by the way, we're going to talk about that some more, because there are people who still teach that today in some Christian-type churches, okay? But also, he was talking about false teaching. And I thought, I didn't talk about this last week. I said, do we have false teachers today? Oh my goodness, but we're not going to talk about that. And I don't want to go into detail of the specific false teachings. But in our culture today, in this country, is the idea that you can't know anything is right or wrong. Everything is relative. You've only heard that 1,000 times in your life. And if everything is relative and there's no such thing as right and wrong, how can you have false teaching? How can you have true teaching? You can't. Which means you end up with believe whatever you want to believe, and it doesn't make any difference. And a lot of people in churches believe exactly that way. People who believe exactly that way have a really hard time with 1 John. Because 1 John is saying to Christians, don't let these people teach you wrong. And last week we started out with 1 John 1:1, and in the very first verse of 1 John 1, I said, well, let me read it to you again. What was from the beginning, what we heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we beheld and our hands handled concerning the word of life. What's the word of life? Christ. And what does he say about Christ that we saw? We meaning the apostles here. We heard him talk, we saw him with our eyes, we beheld, and our hands handled. Remember last week? I talked about him saying right here, we touched him. Why does he put in there about how we touched Jesus? Show that he was human, a real human body. Because Wally, you said something. He wasn't just a spirit. Remember I said last week that in the Gospels the question was, here's this man, this guy. We know his mother and his father and his brothers and sisters. Well, who is this guy? The ultimate was, is he God? And Jesus was God. He came to the earth to be our Savior and all of that. But when the Gnostics came along, they flipped it. They said, oh yeah, Jesus came, he was God, but he wasn't a real person. He didn't have a fleshly body. We just thought we saw. I said he was a ghost last week. To the Gnostics, he was a ghost. 1 John 1:1 is saying that that's not true. John is saying, we touched him. He had a real body. He was a human being. And that first verse is saying that Gnosticism was wrong. The very first verse in the book. John just jumps into it at the very beginning. Okay, anyway, Gnostics had two basic beliefs that everything else was built on. The first one was that salvation is by God revealing secret knowledge that nobody else knows to a person. And that secret knowledge they called gnosis, which is a Greek word, a normal Greek word meaning to know, in a noun and a verb. Gnesko is the verb form of that word. And that word is used, like 23 times in 1 John. And it's a good word, because he's saying Christians can know that they have salvation. But these people were teaching a gnosis, Gnosis. If you want to find something on Wikipedia, look that one up, or Gnosticism, and they have a long article on that. That this was a secret knowledge given by God to revelation to a person. And this is how you're saved. Does this sound a little different than how Christians teach that a person is saved? Christians teach a person is saved by faith. Their idea of how you were saved had nothing to do with faith. It had to do with the secret knowledge that came by revelation. The secret knowledge was superior to the teachings of Jesus and the apostles, and superior to the written word of God in the Bible. So these people would come into the church and they'd say, oh yeah, Jesus said that, but here's something that's more important. Here's something that's more truth. Oh yeah, here's what the Bible says, but no. The truth revealed to us by God directly is more important than that. Do we have people doing that kind of thing today? All the time. What I call, and many people call, modern day prophets. People that say God speaks to them, God inspires them, and that means that what Jesus says and what the Bible says, oh no, that's not so important because this is the truth for us today. But the Gnostics were doing this very same thing back then. Those with special knowledge were considered the spiritual ones, and those without it were called by the Gnostics the carnal ones, meaning worldly, fleshly. Those with the special knowledge became arrogant, lacked love for those without the special knowledge, and wouldn't fellowship them. There's a church in Lansing that I didn't obviously go to, but they had about 2,500 members, and they would not teach you what they believed until you had been with them for 6 to 9 months and had gone through a bunch of preparatory classes. They kept their real teaching secret. If you ask them point blank, do you believe this? Do you believe this? They would refuse to answer the question until you had gone through about 6 to 9 months of their instruction. They had secret knowledge that they wouldn't give out to everybody. Yeah.
You said there was a church in
Lansing. Actually, they have a branch. They were called Church of the Flags, and they decided they wanted to branch out of their main body. And in Grand Blanc, for a while, there was a Church of the Flags congregation. I don't know if they're there nowadays, but I saw it in the Yellow Pages one time. Yeah, they've branched out, but they still run the show in all of these little congregations that they have set up here and there. Anyway, I'm not trying to talk about them. I'm trying to say that if you have a religion that's based on special knowledge that only you have, can you see how that could make you arrogant? Because I'm better than everybody else. I know what you don't know. I have gnosis, the Greek word, and you don't. So I'm superior and you're inferior, and if you go along with me, I'm going to kick you out of the church, if I can do it. You see why this was so terrible? And the church had to face this all through the 2nd century. For 100 years, from AD 100 to AD 200, this was a constant problem in the church. Okay, number one, the Gnostics had two beliefs. First was salvation was by God revealing secret knowledge to a person. And all the way through 1 John, you're going to see the word know, K-N-O-W. Now, there are two words in 1 John for the word know. One's gnosis and the other is another word, which just is a generic word meaning know. And I did a study when Wally pointed this out to me one time years ago, that there's two words for know in 1 John. I did a study to see what do the verses that have gnosis in it say, and what do the verses that use the other word say, and it was really hard for me to separate out the two, and I finally decided that he used the word gnosis as a way of an insult to the Gnostics. And by the way, Gnostic comes from gnosis. It was an insult of John to the Gnostics, saying they think they know, but they really don't know anything. Yeah. Anyway, number one, secret knowledge. Number two, the Gnosticism was based on this every idea. All matter was inherently evil. You know what inherently means? Built in, yeah. You got it whether you know it or not, and you got it whether you like it or not. That means all matter. Now, I'm going to talk about bodies and flesh in a second, but they didn't just mean people. They meant everything. Buildings, the ground, the world, everything had in it evil, including people, all people. Now, we're going to talk about that as to how it's today, but first let me talk to you about how the Gnostics did. So the Gnostics said there's a real problem here. How can a pure and good and holy God have anything to do with evil matter? And in a way, Ted talked about this one time where he talked about Revelation is, in the Bible is about how a pure and holy God deals with sinful man, and all of that. But it's a different thing when you say that all of matter and just flesh and blood is evil. The skin, your stomach. I mean, everything in you is just evil, evil, evil. And they believe that. So they said, well, how can God have any contact, any physical contact with just the world, much less the people in the world who are also evil? And so they came up with this idea that Jesus was God, but he was really just a ghost. He wasn't really here, because if he was really a person, flesh, then this would be God having contact with real evil. And God can't do that, so Jesus was a ghost. Now, there were other Gnostics that said that Jesus was a body, in a human body, but I'm going to use a word just one time. Bear with me, just one time. Anybody ever heard of the word demiurge? Yeah, I know. D-E-M-I-E, D-E-M-I, urge, U-R-G-E, demiurge. I'm sorry? Yeah, all right. Short time. Because they believed that a holy God could have nothing to do with evil matter, they said God created beings below him who were not so pure and could come and be on earth. And that's how angels could appear to people, because they were inferior to God. They were demiurge. That's the inferior. And they said that's how Christ could come to earth, that he was not God. He was created by God, lower than God, and he could come to earth. And it didn't matter because he wasn't God anyway. He was created by God. That was a Gnostic idea. Okay, anyway, there was another Christian, and we're going to talk more about him in a minute. His name was Cerinthus. And is Nathan here? I don't know where Nathan went, but he asked me this week, are you going to talk about Cerinthus? And I said, yeah. So he was happy. He wanted me to talk about Cerinthus. He said that Jesus was a normal man, had a mother and a father just like any other baby born on earth, where the Spirit of Christ came upon him at his baptism and left him just before he got on the cross. That Jesus, God, did not die on the cross, which contradicts everything the Bible says about Jesus paying the price for our sins. Because according to some of the Gnostics, the person who died on the cross was just a man. But also that he was just a man up until the age of 30 when he was baptized. And then Christ came into him. This is all nonsense. But it was a way that the Gnostics had of trying to understand in their background of all of matter being evil, of how God could have anything to do with us. Okay? Because they believed the bodies of people were evil, they would beat themselves. Others thought that their body and spirit were separate, that sin in the body was okay, and the spirit would go to heaven after a person died. Now think about that. Some Gnostics would separate the mind from the body, and the mind is what's going to go to heaven, and there's no problem, and the body could do whatever it wanted, meaning sin, and it didn't matter because the body didn't go to heaven anyway. This was Gnostic thinking. See a little problem with that? Huh? Yes, you see a problem with that. I have met numbers of church people who believe exactly this same thing today. Some of these people, they say they believe in what's called once saved, always saved. And there's about 3 or 4 different ways that people teach once saved, always saved. But one of the ways that people teach once saved, always saved, and there are people who believe this in Flint, Michigan, and Genesee County, will say that the brain doesn't sin, the body sins. The body goes back to the dirt when we die. The mind, the spirit goes back to God. And therefore, if I sin, no problem, I'm still going to heaven. I worked at General Motors one summer with a guy who came in teaching that exact thing. And we were having lunch at 2:30 in the morning because it was third shift. And he's talking about how that he got saved and he can't sin. And if he sins, he won't go to hell anyway. Pretty neat trick if you can get it, isn't it? You know, I can do anything I want. My brain's still going to go to heaven, so I'm okay. Doesn't matter. There are churches today that still teach this. They don't get it out of the Gnostics. They get it out of their own logic. But that's one of the things the Gnostics were teaching. And when we get into reading 1 John, you're going to see verses that talk about this kind of thing and how it's wrong. It's a false teaching. Okay, now we're going to get to Cerinthus. Why do we talk about this guy? He's a real guy. There's evidence that he lived. And he lived in Ephesus at the same time as John, who wrote the gospel and wrote 1 John and 2 John and 3 John. He was a Christian in the 1980s. Well, how do we know this? One of the disciples of John, was a guy named Polycarp. You may have heard that name once or twice. Polycarp knew John. He sat under the feet of John when he was very young, and John was very old, and he learned. When Polycarp got old, he met a young fellow named Irenaeus, and he told Irenaeus everything that John had taught him. And Irenaeus wrote a bunch of writings that are still around today. Irenaeus said that John wrote his gospel to remove that error by which Cerinthus had been spread among men. He also wrote, there are those who heard from him, Polycarp, that John the disciple of the Lord was going to the bathhouse in Ephesus. You know, there's places in the world today that you don't have a bathroom in your own house. You go to the bathhouse in the town to bathe. I went to one of these when I was in Japan a few times, where people don't have a bathtub or shower in their house. They go down to the bathhouse. And I could talk about that because before World War II, the men and women were in there naked together, but we won't talk about that. Anyway, they had these bathhouses in the Roman Empire in the first century. And it says, John the disciple of the Lord was going to bathe at Ephesus, and perceiving Cerinthus within, this guy's already in the bathhouse, he rushed out of the bathhouse without bathing, saying, let us flee, lest even the bathhouse fall down, because Cerinthus, the enemy of the truth, is within. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but this became pretty famous of an event in the life of John that most people think really happened, because Polycarp heard it from John, and Polycarp told Irenaeus, who wrote it down. Cerinthus was a Gnostic, and it would appear in Ephesus during the lifetime of John that there were the Christians meeting in a congregation in Ephesus where John went to church, and there was another congregation over here where Cerinthus was a leader, and he was teaching Gnosticism there. And a lot of people think that John wrote 1 John in 85 AD to have it be read among the churches, congregations in the Ephesian area and around Ephesus that had been influenced by this Gnostic teaching. We don't know that, but it's very possible. Okay, we're going to have to stop. We didn't get into John 1:1, except I read it to you. Any comments on anything that we've said? We got a minute or two for comments. I hope you're enjoying this. I promise you to the depth of my heart, next week we're going to start with 1 John chapter 1. Oh yeah, hey, do me a favor.